What's the first thing that comes to mind when I say Mongolia? Chances are it's one of these three things. The first one is whatever the heck this is supposed to be. The second is massive uninhabitable deserts. And the third one, which is undeniably the most terrifying one, is crazy dudes riding on top of horses, committing war crimes left, right and center, while pillaging small villages all over the Asian continent. Mongolia is undeniably one of the most important and impactful nations in human history. Nations like Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and dozens of others would look nothing like they do today without the Mongolian conquests of the 13th century. However, despite the nation effectively ruling half the planet just 800 years ago, nowadays Mongolia is basically irrelevant on the global stage. So how did any of this even happen? How did a small group of nomads in the middle of the Gobi Desert manage to create the largest empire the world has ever seen, excluding the British? Why did they fall from glory so quickly? And also, what does the modern version of Mongolia and its economy look like nowadays? Let's start breaking down their history from the very beginning. Before Genghis Khan and before all the successful conquests, Mongolia was the literal definition of a dumpster fire. At the time Genghis was born, Mongolia was divided into dozens of different tribes. One of them were the Tatars. These guys controlled the most profitable trade routes and were filthy rich. Another group were the Naimans. They had a massive population and access to very sophisticated technologies. But one of the less notable tribes happened to be the Mongols, who are the protagonists of this story. At that time, the other tribes saw them as nothing more than a small tribe of crazy dudes with severe anger issues and an innate desire to kill everything that moved. All of these tribes not only weren't united, but they hated each other with a burning passion, which meant that the Mongolians found themselves in a constant cycle of internal conflicts. To make things even worse, North China was terrified of them. They literally built the world's largest wall in a desperate attempt to keep them out, and would oftentimes intervene in Mongolian conflicts to keep them divided. At the same time, life there fucking sucked. Temperatures would fluctuate from -35 in the winter to over 40 in the summer. For the Americans that don't know what's a Celsius, basically the first temperature is really cold, and the second one is really hot. Also, in case you didn't know, food doesn't grow in deserts. Because of that, and also the fact Mongolia is flatter than a pancake, the Mongolians chose to live a nomadic lifestyle. They would migrate to one place, use up all the resources, and move to a new place right after. A very unique characteristic of the Mongolians, and the main reason they were so successful at conquest, was their unique way of fighting. China, for example, had way better technology and a massive population compared to Mongolia. Because of that, the Mongolians would never fight them head-on. Instead, they would attack small villages during the winter, and the moment they saw the Chinese military approaching, they would get onto their horses and leave. They basically were large groups of very well-trained bandits. This was an effective strategy for two main reasons. Because of the really cold temperatures back in Mongolia, they were uniquely suited to survive in that environment, while on the other hand, the large technological advanced Chinese army had a hard time adapting to the cold. And secondly, Mongolian horses gave them the ability to very quickly disappear into the nothingness of the Mongolian countryside. However, up until this point, the Mongolians were nothing more than a small speck of dust in the middle of the Mongolian steppe and were only a real threat to some small villages in the north of China. However, everything was about to change. And that's because a young boy by the name of Temujin was about to be born. Genghis Khan, as we know him nowadays, was born near the Onon River of Mongolia in 1162. If you are wondering where that river is on the map, in all honesty, I have no idea. For the first few years of Temujin's life, things went extremely smoothly. He was the son of the tribe leader after all, which meant that he was provided with a very luxurious and privileged lifestyle. However, his whole life was about to turn upside down. At the age of 9, as he was training to become the next successor of the tribe, suddenly his father was poisoned and killed by a rival tribe. Temujin was supposed to take over the throne. However, many members believed that letting an untrained 9-year-old with no experience take over and lead them was a recipe for disaster. So they ended up doing the most logical thing they could think, which was to take the kid of the former leader, along with his mother and siblings, throw them outside of the tribe, and let them survive alone in the middle of the Mongolian wilderness with no equipment. I'm sure he won't come back to take revenge or something crazy like that in the future. Needless to say, this was by far and away the hardest and most difficult period of his life. However, despite the challenges, he seemed to have enjoyed his time in banishment and saw it mostly as a lesson and fuel to motivate himself. After a few years of surviving, he decided that it was finally time to come back, and he even had a great idea on how to do that. His arranged marriage from childhood. The story of what happened in the next few years is kind of weird, but it basically boils down to this. He married her, then she somehow got kidnapped by another tribe because of some things his father did in the past. Then he tried to rescue her and failed miserably. So he went to ask his brother for help, and together they saved her. Now that I think about it, it kind of sounds like the plot of a Mario game. But anyways, however, despite the two brothers teaming up to save her, later down the line the two of them would end up falling into civil war. The actual war or historical events during it are actually not very important or interesting. However, what happens to be super interesting and vital for understanding the future success of the Mongolian Empire is the ideological war behind the actual war. Jamuka had a very traditional view of the world. He was basically what we call an aristocrat. He appointed high-ranking positions exclusively to his friends and family. His desire was to win the war and structure Mongolian society around this idea. He basically wanted to be an OG version of Kim Jong-un, a supreme leader with universal power over his subjects, and all the high-ranking positions would be filled with his family members. Genghis Khan, on the other hand, had a very different approach on this subject. While a little bit of nepotism definitely did exist inside his tribe, for the most part, the society he created was a meritocracy. He allowed people that worked really hard or were very capable at what they do to acquire high-ranking positions. While initially this might sound like a stupid idea and a perfect way to get thrown out of power, in reality, this strategy ended up being his greatest strength. These capable individuals almost always would end up being very grateful to Genghis for the amazing opportunity he provided them with, which not only created a much more capable and well-functioning society, but also a much more loyal one. And unsurprisingly, this ended up being a key reason Genghis would end up winning the civil war. However, that wasn't the only advantage Genghis had over everyone else. He had a few more tricks under his sleeve. The first of many was the adoption of foreign technologies. Running like a madman on top of a horse while shooting arrows at unarmed civilians only gets you so far. Sooner or later you have to siege a city or attack a professional army head-on. However, at least initially, the Mongolian army was extremely underprepared to do that. And this is where Genghis's open-mindedness helped the empire persevere. Whenever he captured foreign engineers or scientists, instead of killing them as revenge, he would instead enlist them into the Mongolian military and use them to make even better weapons. Another major advantage of the Mongolian Empire was its incentive structure. Previously, whenever a raid was successful, the loot from it would almost entirely end up in the hands of the high-ranking officials and the emperor himself. Genghis, once again, had a different approach to this. Instead of stealing all of the wealth for himself and leaving nothing for everyone else, he would instead equally share all of the spoils of war with the members of the empire. He obviously didn't do that because he was a nice guy or because he felt generous. He was a mass murderer after all. The real reason he chose to do that was because it was a very practical way to buy everyone's loyalty. The most notable and important advantage the Mongolians had over everyone else is honestly very clear and simple. Logistics. It might sound a little crazy at first, but if you think about it, this was the main reason the Mongols achieved everything they achieved. During the peak years of the empire, the movement of people, goods, and especially military personnel was conducted at lightning speeds. You probably already know that the Mongols were the facilitators of trade between the East and the West, and they became filthy rich by doing it. The way they were able to facilitate it was by building out a massive network of supply hubs all throughout their own empire and allowing people to trade goods using them. But their military was undoubtedly even more impressive. The main problem with European and Chinese armies are horses. While they are extremely useful, they also have a massive negative. They get tired extremely easily. Because of that, it's really hard for a typical army to travel massive distances simply because the horses need to rest up. However, the Mongols had a great idea to deal with that. Firstly, each soldier wasn't given a single horse, but instead each one had 4 or 5 of them. Those horses were scattered all throughout different supply hubs inside of the vast empire. So instead of a soldier needing to wait for his horse to rest, he could simply get another one from the supply hub and keep moving forward. Because of that, it wasn't rare for the Mongols to surprise attack their enemies. They might have thought that they had weeks to prepare, but because the Mongols never had to rest, in reality they only had a few days before the raid began. With so many things working for them, it should honestly come to you as no surprise that the Mongols became as powerful as they did. Roughly within a century, they went from a tiny nation north of China to controlling the flow of global trade and changing the global geopolitical landscape forever. However, just as fast as it rose into greatness, just as fast the nation collapsed into nothingness. But why? What could potentially cause such a devastating fall-off? And could the Mongols have done anything about it? Behind the collapse of the empire, there existed 3 main factors. The first and most obvious one was internal disputes. Up until 1259, the entirety of the empire was controlled by a single person. However, after a succession crisis, the empire found itself split into 4 different parts, and as you can expect, all of them them, in classic Mongolian fashion, started fighting each other right after. I guess old habits never die. The second factor behind their failures were external developments, specifically two main problems: gunpowder and the Black Death. If you've ever attempted to shoot a gun while riding a horse, you might have noticed a tiny problem. It's basically impossible to aim properly. Because gunpowder was such a game-changing technology and the Mongols relied so heavily on horses, they had an extremely hard time adapting to the new realities. And obviously the Black Death was catastrophic news for the Mongolians. But the main issue behind their lightning-fast collapse was that the empire was addicted to growth. The social contract was that as the empire grew in size, the people loyal to it would become richer and richer. However, when the empire reached a certain size, it became excessively hard to grow further. Taking over Western Europe was a massive challenge. Invading the Middle East was impossible, and the two attacks they attempted on Japan both ended up as massive failures. They simply had no extra room to grow. And because of that, more and more people started seeing less economic incentive to stay loyal to the empire. Nowadays, Mongolia is a shadow of its former self. It has a tiny population, a minuscule economy, and is nothing more than a buffer state between two superpowers, which is kind of ironic considering that both of those nations owe their existence, at least partially, to the Mongols. Anyways, guys, click here to watch another one of my videos and have a great rest of your day.